The longest winter Matt woke up to the sound of wind howling outside, a shrieking wail that seemed to tear at the very walls of their small cabin. He pulled the thick woolen blankets tighter around himself, but the cold seeped in anyway, through the floorboards, the cracks in the windowsill, and through the very air itself. It was like the cold had a mind of its own, determined to invade every inch of their world. Sarah was still asleep beside him, her face turned toward the window, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For a moment, everything felt normal, like it had before the storm, before everything had started to change. But then, the realization hit Matt again. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen the sun. It had been weeks, maybe months. He had lost track of time. The snowstorms had started in late November, just a light dusting at first, but the storms had grown worse, heavier. By December, they had begun to bury the town under layers of snow, each storm more intense than the last. By January, it was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the storm, leaving the small town of Blackwood trapped in an endless winter. Matt reached for his phone on the nightstand. It had been dead for days, but he still checked it. Maybe he thought there was a signal somewhere deep in the mountains. Maybe he thought someone, anyone, would reach out to him. But all he ever saw was the spinning wheel, the same nothingness. He sighed, setting the phone back down. There were no calls, no messages, no word from the outside world, no word from anyone. Sarah stirred beside him, groggily rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "Is it still snowing?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. She had asked the same question every morning for the past 2 weeks. Matt didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. That the snow never stopped, that the storm was never ending. "Yeah," he replied, his voice hoarse. "It's still snowing." She glanced out the window, and Matt followed her gaze. All he could see was a white blur, the snow falling in thick sheets, swirling in the wind. The storm had trapped them in their own home, cut off from the rest of the world. There was no way to know what was happening outside, no way to know if anyone was even alive. Matt tried to push the thought away. They were fine, he told himself. They had food, they had firewood. As long as they kept their heads down and stayed inside, they would survive. But the longer the storm went on, the more that hope started to wither. Sarah stood up, pulling on her coat and boots. "I'll check the wood pile," she said. "I'll grab some more logs for the stove." Matt nodded, but he didn't move. He stayed in the bed, staring at the snow outside, the endless snow that had buried their world. The isolation was suffocating. The world had gone quiet, too quiet. There were no cars passing by, no voices calling in the street, no sounds of life at all. He had started to hear things in the storm, strange noises. Sometimes it sounded like something was moving outside, scraping against the walls of the cabin. Other times, it was whispers, faint voices carried on the wind. Growls too, like the sound of something huge and hungry, something waiting in the storm. At first, Matt tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. He had no way to explain it, and the longer the storm raged, the more it seemed like the noise was getting closer. Sarah returned shortly after, carrying an armful of firewood. She tossed the logs onto the stove, and the warmth filled the room, momentarily pushing back the chill that had settled in. "I think we need to go for help," Sarah said, her voice steady but strained. "We can't keep going like this. The power's been out for over a week now. We're running out of food, and I don't feel right, Matt." Matt didn't respond immediately. The thought had crossed his mind too. Leaving the house, venturing into the storm to find help, but every time he considered it, something inside him recoiled. The storm was too fierce. The cold was too brutal. They had no guarantee they would make it out alive. "We need to stay here," Matt finally said, his voice tight. "We need to conserve what we've got. We can make it." Sarah gave him a long look, but she didn't argue. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded. But the tension in the air hadn't gone away. They were both scared. And it was only a matter of time before that fear turned into something else. Something darker. That night the storm grew worse. Matt lay awake in bed listening to the wind batter the house. The howling scream of it almost deafening. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, but it wasn't enough to keep the chill at bay. He heard it again. The scrape of something against the cabin, like claws dragging along wood. He thought it was just his imagination. But then he heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. Matt's blood ran cold. It was a voice, low, guttural, like something not human. And it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house. He froze, staring at the dark corner of the room. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything but the storm. But something was there. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Sarah, who was still asleep beside him. His hand trembled as he reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. The beam flickered to life, casting a pale light across the room. Nothing. Matt's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't imagined it. Something was in the cabin with them. Something was waiting. And it wasn't alone. Matt's breath quickened, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand as it swept the room. But all he could see was darkness and the faint outlines of their furniture. The house was still, save for the howling wind outside. The growl, that low guttural sound, had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But Matt could still feel it. A presence, something lurking just out of sight. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering light from the stove. The shadows felt wrong, like they were shifting, but not in the natural way the light should have cast them. He looked over at Sarah, still asleep, unaware of the terror that gripped him. He had to be sure. He had to know if what he'd heard was real. Matt slid quietly out of bed, careful not to wake her. The cold from the floor sent a shiver up his spine as his bare feet made contact with the wood. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat sounding like a drum in the silence. He crept toward the window, moving slowly, so as not to make a sound. He raised the blinds, the cold night air flooding the room with a bitter bite, and he peered outside. The storm raged on, the snow blurring everything into a foggy haze. He saw nothing. Then from the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Just outside the cabin, near the woods, two dark shapes moving in the snow. They were low to the ground, almost like animals, but they were too big to be animals. Matt's heart skipped a beat. The growl, the whisper, it wasn't just in his head. Something was out there. Before he could think better of it, he grabbed his coat and slipped outside. The cold hit him like a slap in the face, the wind biting through his clothing. But he didn't stop. He had to see it, whatever it was. The door creaked shut behind him, the sound like a warning. The night was unnaturally quiet, aside from the wind. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way to the edge of the woods, his flashlight barely cutting through the storm. He could feel the presence again, just beyond the tree line, and his skin crawled as if it were alive, watching him. The dark shapes moved again. There. He could see them now. Two tall figures, almost human in shape, but their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky. They didn't walk, they slid, like they were gliding across the snow, never quite touching the ground. Suddenly, let's continue the story from where we left off. The longest winter. Continued. Matt's breath quickened, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand as it swept the room, but all he could see was darkness and the faint outlines of their furniture. The house was still, save for the howling wind outside. The growl, that low guttural sound, had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But Matt could still feel it, a presence, something lurking just out of sight. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering light from the stove. The shadows felt wrong, like they were shifting, but not in the natural way the light should have cast them. He looked over at Sarah, still asleep, unaware of the terror that gripped him. He had to be sure. He had to know if what he'd heard was real. Matt slid quietly out of bed, careful not to wake her. The cold from the floor sent a shiver up his spine as his bare feet made contact with the wood. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat sounding like a drum in the silence. He crept toward the window, moving slowly so as not to make a sound. He raised the blinds, the cold night air flooding the room with a bitter bite, and he peered outside. The storm raged on, the snow blurring everything into a foggy haze. He saw nothing. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Just outside the cabin, near the woods, two dark shapes moving in the snow. They were low to the ground, almost like animals, but they were too big to be animals. Matt's heart skipped a beat. The growl, the whisper, it wasn't just in his head. Something was out there. The cabin felt too small, too suffocating. The wind still howled outside, but the terror had settled in his chest, gnawing at him. He tried to catch his breath, tried to shake the image of those figures from his mind, but it wouldn't leave. It couldn't. Sarah was awake now, sitting up in bed, her wide eyes filled with concern. "Matt, what's going on?" What happened? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. What could he tell her? What could he say that would make sense of what he'd seen? There's something out there, he stammered. Figures. People. But not people. Something's out there, Sarah. And I don't think we're alone in this storm anymore. Sarah didn't say anything for a long moment. The wind howled louder, shaking the house as if it were trying to get inside. She looked at him, then to the window, as if she was trying to see what he had seen. I think we need to leave, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Matt shook his head, a feeling of dread settling deep in his gut. We can't. The storm, everything's blocked. We'll freeze before we even make it out of the woods. But we can't stay here, she said, her voice a little more frantic. Matt, we're not safe. Whatever's out there, it's not natural. He had never seen her so scared before, and he couldn't blame her. He felt the same way, but there was something deeper gnawing at him, something darker. He didn't want to admit it to Sarah, didn't want to say it out loud. But the storm, it felt like it was alive, like it had been waiting for them. We can't stay here, Sarah repeated. But where can we go? What can we do? Matt stood there, trying to force his mind to work, to come up with a plan. But nothing made sense. Everything felt wrong. The storm had never stopped. The snow was never ending. The shadows outside weren't just a product of the dark. They were something else. That was when it hit him. The town, Blackwood, the endless snow, the strange sounds, the figures in the woods. It all made sense now, in a way that terrified him more than anything. We're stuck, he whispered. Sarah's face paled. What do you mean? I think we're caught in something. Something that's not letting us leave. Something that's keeping us here. The storm. It's never going to end, Sarah. Not until what? Matt turned to face her, his eyes wide with the weight of the realization. Not until we do what it wants. Matt's chest tightened as he realized the full scope of the terror. The storm, the figures, the eerie sounds. It wasn't random. It was a loop, a trap. The town of Blackwood, buried under endless snow, was cursed, caught in an unbreakable cycle of winter. And they were part of it. Sarah's face was pale, eyes wide with fear. What do we do, Matt? What can we do? He didn't have an answer. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on them, suffocating the life from the town and its people. He had always heard stories of cursed places, old ghost towns, abandoned mines, forgotten villages, but he never imagined he'd find himself trapped in one. The whispers had started again, echoing through the walls of the cabin. This time, they weren't just whispers. They were words, clear and sharp. Leave the house. It was a voice, but not one that belonged to Sarah or anyone else he knew. It was cold and hollow, like it was coming from deep underground. The words lingered in the air, then faded into the howling wind. No, don't, Sarah said, gripping his arm. Don't go outside again, Matt. Please, it's not safe. He wanted to listen to her, but something primal, drove him forward. He had to find the source of the voices. He had to understand what had happened to the town, and why they were caught in this nightmare. Matt moved toward the door, his legs heavy, as if the storm was dragging him down. But he couldn't stop. He opened it slowly, the cold air biting into his skin as the wind tore at his clothes. Outside, the figures were waiting again. They were silent now, standing still in the thick snow, their faces obscured in shadow. But he knew they were aware of him. They always were. The growls started again, low rumbling sounds that vibrated through the earth. But this time, Matt wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, his body moving with a strange, unnatural resolve. The figures didn't move. They just watched him, their eyes glowing faintly in the storm. Matt's breath was shallow, his hands trembling. He couldn't understand what was happening, but the feeling of inevitability was overwhelming. He couldn't escape, not unless he did something to break the cycle. The wind howled louder, the snow swirling around him, but Matt didn't turn back. He walked toward the center of the down, the figures following him silently. As he stepped into the heart of Blackwood, something shifted in the air. The snow, the wind, the storm, all of it felt like a wall closing in on him. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, as if the town itself was alive, holding its breath. Then he saw it. A figure standing in the center of the square, cloaked in shadow. It was tall, its features impossible to make out, but it was clearly watching him. Matt knew, without a doubt, that this was the one controlling everything. The storm, the endless winter, the figures. "You're the one who's keeping us here," Matt said, his voice hoarse. "Why?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, as if it were waiting for something. "Leave the house," the voice echoed again, louder this time, coming from everywhere at once. "Leave the house and never return." A sickening realization washed over him. The town was trapped. They were all trapped, and there was only one way out. Matt's hands shook as he stepped closer to the figure. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what the sacrifice would be, but he felt it in the pit of his stomach. He had to be the one to end it. The figure's gaze shifted, locking onto him. Its eyes burned like fire, piercing through the storm, and for a moment, Matt felt himself being pulled into them. He could see visions, flashes of the past, of lives long gone, of those who had tried and failed to escape the cycle before him. Their faces twisted in pain, their eyes wide with terror, forever frozen in time. He stepped forward again, the cold now biting through him like 1,000 needles. The wind whipped around him, the snow blinding, but he didn't stop. He was ready. In that moment, Matt understood what had to be done. He had to offer himself, his soul, into the cycle, to become a part of the town's endless winter, so that Sarah and the others might be freed. There was no other way out. Matt collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm howled around him, and the figure reached out a hand, its long fingers brushing against his skin. He felt the cold, the pull of eternity, and the weight of the world as he surrendered. Epilogue. Sarah never saw Matt again. When the snow finally stopped, when the storm broke, and the sun shone once more, Blackwood was no longer the ghost town it had been. It had transformed, the snow receding like a bad memory. The townsfolk returned to their lives, unaware of what had truly transpired in the heart of their town. But there was one thing they could never forget: the photograph. Matt's photograph, found by Sarah in the attic, buried beneath old boxes and forgotten memories. It was a picture of Matt, his smile wide and unnaturally perfect, his eyes wide open, frozen in time. And in the reflection of his eyes, there was something dark, something that wasn't quite right. A smile that stretched too far.